Hello and welcome to the first ever Propagandopolis podcast. So today I'm speaking with Roland Elliott Brown. He's a London-based writer who the year before last published a book called Godless Utopia, Soviet Anti-Religious Propaganda. It's a beautifully put together book that tells the story of Soviet atheism through 7 decades worth of propaganda posters. And it's available to buy on our website now. That's propagandopolis.com. So, Roland, I thought we could start this podcast by talking about the origins of the book, specifically about what inspired you to write it and what sort of background you had and what sort of research you'd done beforehand into the honestly pretty niche topic of Soviet anti-religious propaganda.
As near as I'm transparent to myself, it seems to me that this project has something to do with having grown up in North America during the Reagan era. Now, I was born in 1980. I grew up in Canada, but I think that kind of Reagan era culture was all defining in North America, really. And there were certain memes bubbling up in the culture, when I was still a little kid that I was not aware of at the time. But so in 1983, for example, we had Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech. And in that speech, Reagan centers Lenin's rejection of religious morality in favor of class morality as the source of Soviet unfreedom. And he did that to a gathering of evangelicals. So it was kind of, he was speaking to his moral majority faction, Christian conservative faction. And then there was an interesting speech that Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave in London on receipt of the Templeton Prize, in which he not only centers atheism as the source of all of Russia's catastrophes, but he also rejects the Enlightenment. So whereas Reagan was happy to center Lenin and atheism as the problem, Solzhenitsyn goes one further and he says, well, what about including pursuit of happiness in the U.S. Declaration of Independence? And he implicitly drags Thomas Jefferson and the whole European Enlightenment into this problem of atheism and tyranny as he saw it. I don't think anyone ever put quite such a fine point on the matter as Solzhenitsyn did there. And he also laments a blasphemous film being shown in the supposedly religious United States. And that, if you read between the lines, it's obviously Monty Python's Life of Brian. I was not conscious of this stuff because I was just a little kid at the time, but it was a meme that was bubbling up in the culture. And then I became conscious of it after 9/11 when we had a whole bunch of popular atheist tracks by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris. And they were all, in a sense, a reaction to that post 9/11 mood. There was obviously the horror at jihadist terrorism, but there was also resentment of George W. Bush's relationship with the Christian right. And in the midst of that debate over this new popular atheism movement, that old meme from the 80s began to bubble up. And people like Hitchens and Dawkins would find themselves confronted on Fox News by people who again wanted to center atheism as a source of the catastrophes of the 20th century.
Cool. So that's what kindled your interest in the topic in the broader sense. So what inspired you writing this book specifically about Soviet atheism?
So I think I got into this project in a fairly open-minded and inquisitive way. I wanted to investigate this whole Soviet atheism phenomenon, which was extremely low resolution. Like, people mention it all the time, but people didn't know anything about it, really. They didn't know it in detail. They probably knew that, they knew that the Soviet Union was officially atheistic. They knew that Karl Marx had said religion was the opium of the people. And that was about it. And so I began to delve in, and finding the details of this phenomenon was a bit tricky because most of the popular histories that you would read of the Soviet Union, they would barely mention it. It might be a paragraph somewhere, or it would be mentioned kind of by the by. there are a few exceptions, like Richard Pipes in his Russia Under the Bolshevik Regime gives a chapter to it. And of course, he was someone who was of the right and was an advisor to Reagan. But most of the research materials I found were from sometime during the Soviet period. There were things that people were writing probably mainly in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so I began researching that in the early 2010s. And then the guys at Fuel Publishing, who I knew because I'd interviewed them for the Moscow Times, and I'd also I'd reviewed some of their books. They had found or bought online a bunch of Soviet anti-religious posters from the 60s to the 80s, and they had a notion to do a book based on those. And they asked me to do the writing, and I was aware of some of the earlier graphics. I'd become aware of some of the earlier graphics, which I'd seen in an exhibition at one point. And well, I immediately saw the foundations of the themes of the later posters in the earlier ones, and made a case that those should be included. And the project evolved along those lines.
So I imagine you saw a lot of original copies of these posters when you were researching the book.
Yeah, they're fairly easy to come by in libraries in Russia. They're like the big libraries, like the Lenin Library in Moscow, and the library of the State Museum of the History of Religions in St. Petersburg, which originally was an official atheist museum.
Yeah, definitely. It's really cool seeing all these posters in the flesh. I've only seen, a few exhibitions here in London, most recently at the Royal Academy and the Tate, I think, but they're pretty damn cool. Anyway, so to move on, you write in the book about how the Orthodox Church in Russia from sort of Peter the Great onwards, so that's around the 17th, 18th century, was having its authority questioned and challenged by Enlightenment ideas coming predominantly from the West. I was wondering if we could speak a little bit about that and how that would have paved the way for atheism to gain a foothold in certain radical circles in the 19th century.
Well, speaking of Solzhenitsyn, in his Templeton speech, he implicitly or explicitly, I can't remember, he blames Peter the Great for kind of imposing the European Enlightenment from above in Russia. And certainly Peter the Great was responsible for making the church subordinate to the state, making it a tool of his administration. So
by the early 20th century, the church was more or less entirely subordinate to the Tsarist regime.
Yeah, well, do you remember in Animal Farm, Orwell refers to Moses the Raven, who's the representative of the Russian Orthodox Church. He refers to him as a spy and a talebearer. And yeah. So this is kind of like the radical Russian view of the church. It's a servant of the state. So that idea was there. Peter the Great, although he made the church subordinate to himself, he also saw himself as an enlightening figure, someone who was pro-science, pro-enlightenment, and was prepared to impose some of those views from above as well, and to modernize with a hard hand. And so there are echoes of that in Bolshevism, for sure. That said, in 1917, the church was on the verge of becoming more independent. Because of the revolution, it was able to elect a patriarch for the first time since Peter the Great had abolished the patriarchate. And so the Bolsheviks faced a stronger and more independent adversary, and within a year, the new patriarch, Tikhon, anathematized the Bolsheviks.
Okay, so when did the Russian communist movement begin to become more explicitly associated with atheism? When did atheism begin to emerge as a prominent force in Russian radical politics?
Okay, well, atheism comes to Russia through a variety of channels. It comes to Russia mainly through contact with Western thought. And of course, Russian intellectuals were back and forth to Western Europe all the time. And so they're influenced by Western thought, particularly thought coming out of German universities, where there's the phenomenon known as higher criticism. That's kind of like advanced textual criticism of the Bible. That area of study gives rise to the group known as the Young Hegelians, which of course is very influential on Marx. So Marx is not, of course, the first atheistic influence on the Russian intellectuals, but Marx is being influenced in parallel, shall we say. So this German thought, this higher textual criticism, is influencing Marx when he's at university, and it's also influencing Russian intellectuals. Two of the main figures in Russian atheism of the 19th century were two priests' sons, Nikolai Czernashevsky, Nikolai Dobrolubov, who were the first to deny the existence of God in print. That episode is described in a book called Doubt, Atheism, and the 19th Century Russian Intelligentsia by Victoria Frieda. So anyone who wants to delve deeper can have a look at that book. So yeah, there are these parallel influences on both Marx and on the Russian intellectuals. And of course, when Marx and Engels become aware of Czernashevsky, they praise his work. Czernashevsky is a massive influence on Lenin. And Lenin was into Czernashevsky before he was into Marx. Of course, when he reads Marx, it's just fireworks. So these different strands are coming together. There were other atheistic influences. Of course, Marx's great rival, the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, was a public atheist as well. And of course, those Russian intellectuals who were in touch with the West, in touch with Germany, they would have been reading Nietzsche, they would have been reading Schopenhauer. Very interestingly, Nietzsche's work was suppressed and disapproved of in the Soviet Union.
Okay, so what did Marx have to say about religion? I know there's that really famous opium of the people quote, but it's often quoted just that line out of context. Could we talk a little bit about what Marx himself said about atheism and the place of religion?
So I'll give you a reading from Marx's famous introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, in which he refers to the opium of the people. And this reading is slightly abridged. He writes, "Religious distress is at the same time the expression of real distress and the protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, just as it is the spirit of a spiritless situation. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is required for their real happiness. The demand to give up the illusions about its condition is the demand to give up a condition which needs illusions." He goes on to say of the criticism of religion, "Criticism has plucked the imaginary flowers from the chain, not so that man will wear the chain without any fantasy or consolation, but so that he will shake off the chain and cull the living flower." So this is a philosophy of liberation. This is from his early life. This is from the young Hegelian phase. Marx of Capital, decades later, writes that what he calls humanity's religious reflex will vanish only when, quote, "the practical relations of everyday life offer to man none but perfectly intelligible and reasonable relations with regard to his fellow men and to nature." So in the first quote, you have this idea of the abolition of religion being necessary for people's happiness. And in Capital, you have this idea that once everything's great, religion will disappear by itself. And you can see the tension that this sets up for the Bolsheviks, because the persistence of religion as a phenomenon then becomes a test for their own success. So if religion persists, it means that they're failing. They're failing to create a utopia.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because obviously most people associate Marx's writings on religion with that early opium of the people passage. I didn't realize that there was a sort of second phase, if you will, to his attitudes on religion. So I was wondering if we could sort of jump ahead a few decades now and start talking about the Bolsheviks in power, or how they seized power, and the sort of anti-religious propagandizing that went along with that.
Okay, so let's dive into the moment after the October Revolution. So atheism is synonymous with Bolshevism. They're very closely tied together, and the atheist agenda it's even a little bit higher on the Bolshevik agenda than you might expect. So the early years of the Bolshevik project are marked by the Russian Civil War, the civil war against the whites who are trying to crush the revolution, and there's massive internal conflict between the Bolsheviks and religious believers, and also between the Bolsheviks and the newly elected patriarch Tikhon, who is not happy with the fratricidal situation in the country and who anathematized the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, and isn't there that book that you mentioned in Godless Utopia, co-authored by Bukharin, the old Bolshevik, that sort of explains early Soviet anti-religious propaganda?
There's a fascinating text which appears around 1920 by two leading Bolsheviks, Nikolai Bukharin and Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, who incidentally were later killed in Stalin's terror. The ABC of Communism is a commentary on the first Bolshevik Party program of 1919, and it lays out the beginnings of a philosophy of Soviet atheist propaganda strategy. And I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from the ABC of Communism. The authors write, "It is essential at the present time to wage with the utmost vigor the war against religious prejudices, for the Church has now definitely become a counter-revolutionary organization and endeavors to use its religious influence over the masses in order to marshal them for the political struggle against the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Orthodox faith, which is defended by the priests, aims at an alliance with the monarchy. This is why the Soviet power finds it necessary to engage at this juncture in widespread anti-religious propaganda. Our aims can be secured by the delivery of special lectures, by the holding of debates, and by the publication of suitable literature, also by the general diffusion of scientific knowledge, which slowly but surely undermines the authority of religion." Then they go on to describe a fascinating episode that took place in the early days of the revolution, where the Bolsheviks would go into churches and they would smash open what were called relics. These were the bodies of saints, which were believed not to decay, and they would expose them to the public. So here the authors are writing about this in the ABC of Communism. They write, "An excellent weapon in the fight with the Church was used recently in many parts of the Republic when the shrines were opened to show the, quote, incorruptible relics. This served to prove to the wide masses of the people, and precisely to those in whom religious faith was strongest, the base trickery upon which religion in general and the creed of the Russian Orthodox Church in particular are grounded." So this grisly image of caskets being broken open as a spectacle for the public found its way into Soviet propaganda graphics. So there's one image, for example, from Godless Machine magazine, 1924. It's called The Imperishable Ones, or it could be The Incorruptibles. And it shows God looks like he's at a table, and at the table are the skeletons and mummies of these saints. And he says that they've let him down. He says, "You've let me down, my minions. I'm ashamed to be seen on earth now." And around the table, these figures are all names. They're all figures from Orthodox tradition and lore. And this idea of the mummies also comes into the design of the book, because if you look at the cover of the book, you have this skeletal figure cloaked in kind of the generic robes of faith, and he's reaching in a menacing way for this gilded hammer and sickle, and that's a clear homage to that image and to this early Bolshevik scheme of showing off these corpses and mummies.
Yeah, well, it's a beautifully designed book, and if we can afford to go on a quick digression, maybe we could talk about the design of the book actually, and how the Soviet posters from the period kind of inspired it.
The design of the book, which is by my collaborators at Fuel Publishing, really references religious publishing in a lot of creative ways. So, for example, this gilded hammer and sickle, well, it makes you think a little bit of the gilded designs on a Bible, or the black edged pages. It makes you think of the colored edged pages on religious texts and Bibles. So there's all kinds of advanced design thinking going into making the book an attractive object.
Yeah, it's this beautiful book. It looks like loads of thought went into it. To quickly return to the posters, there's another one from around the early 20s that kind of relates to what we were talking about with the exhumed mummies, and it's that one of sort of Jesus's corpse is kind of blue, and there are lots of people gnawing at it. Could we talk a little bit about that one, because it's definitely the most striking from the early period, I think.
It's a horror movie image. It's profoundly grisly. So there's a dead Christ lying on the ground, and the peasants are stripping his flesh and pulling out his guts and gnawing his body and taking away one of his arms and gathering blood that's pouring out of his side. And this gory image is really atypical.
Yeah, definitely. It's unique among all of the posters from that period for how graphic it is. And I think in the book, or maybe in a previous podcast I listened to, you say that it's almost just a way of boasting of the Soviets' power and sort of the church's relative weakness.
So this image is it's really a provocation and a display of power in a way. There was concern among the Bolsheviks, even early on, as early as 1919, about offending religious believers. There was a lot of back and forth about the risks associated with offending religious believers. And one idea was that offending religious believers led to religious fanaticism. In other words, it didn't serve the interests of the party. And that conversation went on and on throughout the Soviet period, went back and forth. But this is probably the most intentionally offensive image in the book. And it's, on one level, it's a satire of communion, and this idea that communion contains within it the principle of cannibalism. But it also, the really horrifying thing about it is that it seems to be an allusion to the terrible famine, so-called Volga famine, although it was actually a famine across much of the Soviet Union, which had led to cannibalism. There'd been all this grain requisitioning during the Civil War. There'd been famine just because of the conditions of the Civil War as well, and the peasantry was in absolutely dire and terrible situation. There were instances of cannibalism across the country, and this seems almost to mock their suffering and to blame Christianity for this cannibalism crisis. And the Bolsheviks intentionally used this famine against the church. They used it as a pretext to seize church valuables and sell them abroad, ostensibly to pay for famine relief, but in fact, there was more foreign aid coming into the Russian ports from the American Relief Administration, among others, than they could move across the country. So it was a false pretext. And Richard Pipes suggests that it's wrapped up with the need to pay off debts at the Genoa conference, which is coming up at that time.
So Lenin and the Bolsheviks were beginning to antagonize and demonize the church on the grounds that they were creating the conditions for famine or exacerbating them. And the Soviets used this as a rationale to appropriate the church's wealth. Is that correct?
So amidst this nationwide famine and the conflicts with believers over the seizure of church property, Lenin consciously decided to use the phenomenon of cannibalism against the church There was a document which is not in his collected writings, which was revealed by some émigré magazine in the 1970s. After a conflict, a well-known conflict between religious believers defending their church and the Bolsheviks who went to seize church property, Lenin wrote in an internal memo, I believe that here our enemy commits a major blunder trying to engage us in a decisive struggle when for him it is especially hopeless and especially inconvenient. It is now and only now, when in the regions afflicted by the famine, there is cannibalism and the roads are littered with hundreds, if not thousands of corpses, that we can, and therefore must, pursue the acquisition of values with the most ferocious and merciless energy, stopping at nothing and suppressing all resistance. So the famine is an opportunity to smash the church.
Which the Bolsheviks promptly do. I was wondering if you could move on to start talking about the two magazines that emerged in the early 20s, Godless and Godless at the Machine. They were the sort of two primary anti-religious propaganda organs of the early Soviet regime, and they formed the bulk of the posters that are exhibited in Godless Utopia, at least in the first half. So could we talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, there's a curious history surrounding these magazines. They both started around the same time. I think there was a newspaper called Godless in maybe 1922. Then this color magazine called Godless appears. This is the one that has the cannibalism image, and then there's a wrangle over the name between two editors. So there's Maria Kostyulovskaya, the full color magazine, and then there's a guy named Emilian Yaroslavsky, who was quite close to Stalin. I think he had launched the newspaper, and then he launched a competing publication around 1924 or 5, I can't remember. And so there was a battle over the name of this magazine, and it was kind of like a Python-esque battle between ideological atheists in the early Soviet state. And eventually Yaroslavsky won that one, so Kostyulovskaya had to change the name of her publication to Bezbožnik Ustanka. So it's something like Godless at the Machine, or sometimes translated as Godless at the Workbench or Godless at the Machine Tool. I decided to keep it brief in my translation.
Yeah, Python-esque, I like that. I imagine there are a lot of similar sort of Python-esque tussles over names in the early Soviet Union. So if I remember correctly, these two publications were merged together in the late 20s. I think Godless at the Machine was sort of forcibly merged with Godless, if that's correct.
Yeah, they were folded together in the early 30s, I think.
Okay, and while they were both existing in a sort of rivalry, I know they competed for, the artistic talent of the day, chief among which was Dimitri Moore, he was an artist from the revolutionary period, and then his career was sort of established in the 20s, I believe, and his pieces appear very prominently in the first half of Godless Utopia. So I was wondering if we could speak a little bit about him.
Yeah, so Dimitri Moore was the main anti-religious artist, the best-known anti-religious artist of the Soviet period. Moore, as you would probably guess, is not a Russian surname. It actually comes from a play by Schiller called The Robbers. So the Moore is a character in this play, and that was his socialist nom de guerre. And there's a great quote from Dimitri Moore, who was, by the way, a total gun for hire, not someone whose views could be discerned from his work. So, for example, if you go to the Tate Modern in London, they sell a poster by Dimitri Moore where he's appealing to the Muslims of the Caucasus to join the communist cause. And that was from the Civil War period. And at the same time, he's also the most prominent atheistic artist of the early Soviet period.
Yeah, I actually remember seeing that Muslim propaganda poster, or rather the propaganda poster calling on the Muslims to aid the revolution. It's a characteristically colourful piece. So anyway, you were saying that there was a quote from Dimitri Moore that kind of captures all of his philosophy towards propaganda and his mission as a propagandist.
So here's a translation of Dimitri Moore talking about his kind of mission statement as a Stalinist atheist propagandist. He says, everywhere the poster powerfully demands attention and speaks to the topic of the day. It bristles, castigates, illuminates, carries to action, reveals the task at hand and the widest horizons of socialist construction. The poster activates the builders of socialism and infuriates the class enemy. So there's that idea of dominance. So if you think of that cannibalism poster, it's an assertion of dominance over people who can't really fight back. One of the really typical Moore images, which is from 1923, it was on the cover of the color magazine Godless, later Godless at the Machine. And it shows a worker climbing into the heavens to smash a bunch of deities with his hammer. Below him on the left, there are the factory smokestacks. That's the sign of progress. And below him to the right are the ruins of religious temples. I see a synagogue, I see a church, and I see a mosque, all down there together. And the slogan on top says, "We finished the earthly czars, and we're coming for the heavenly ones." Well, that's a mission statement of Soviet atheism right there. And it also carries premonitions of the space race. This idea of storming the heavens becomes important when the Soviets start to get into space. So I guess it's prophetic in that sense. So while we're talking about these representations of the different deities, along with this worker storming the heavens, we should take a moment to think about the representation of Islam in these cartoons, because, of course, Islam-related cartoons are always in the news these days. And one curious thing I found or didn't find while I was doing this research was that, well, there didn't seem to be any Muhammad cartoons in the Soviet anti-religious magazines. There were kind of generic representations of an Islamic god or Allah, but there were no depictions of Muhammad, or nothing that I could definitively say was a depiction of Muhammad. And well, in one review in the Critic magazine, Giles Udy falsely claimed that there were Muhammad cartoons in the book, which I thought was dangerous and irresponsible. And I had to write in to get that corrected. But it raises an interesting question, which is how Fuel Publishing and I would have handled that had it come up. Because in the context of a historical study, if we had found some graphically interesting depiction of Muhammad, from the point of view of a historical study, it would have been perfectly legitimate to include it. But at the same time, we would have had to have a very serious conversation about the risks involved. It is interesting that didn't come up. And the depictions of Islam in the book, they tend always to focus either on kind of foolish and ridiculous mullahs misleading the people, or the oppression of women.
Yeah, it's something you wouldn't really think about, would you, with Soviet anti-religious propaganda? Did you ever encounter any sort of written content in these magazines about Muhammad, or was it just completely off limit?
I did come across some articles in the Soviet magazines discussing whether Muhammad had existed, but those were not heavily illustrated.
Interesting. So I was wondering if we could move on to the late 20s and 30s, the Stalinist period. The Godless and Godless and Machine have obviously merged, and the focus of atheist propaganda is beginning to shift.
By the late 1920s and early 30s, Stalin is consolidating power as general secretary. He's setting himself up as the long-term dictator of the Soviet state. And at the same time, it's becoming apparent that this Bolshevik idea of triggering a world revolution that's going to be sympathetic to the Soviets, that's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not as if the industrialized Western European countries are going to join this project now. So Stalin is battening down for kind of resentful isolation, and he's concerned about the weakness of the Soviet state, which is not heavily industrialized, and he's fearful of foreign intervention and fearful of the rising threat of fascism as well. In 1930, Pope Pius XI declared a crusade of prayer against the Soviet state, against Soviet atheism. And, well, if we consider what fascism was in the early days, Nazism slightly complicates the picture later on. But in the early days, fascism is the Catholic far right. There's fear of a crusade, and then crusade becomes one of the central themes of the anti-religious propaganda, which also taps into kind of cultural memory about conflicts between the Orthodox and the Catholics, although I don't think that's particularly intentional at this stage.
So what sort of thematic changes are happening in Soviet anti-religious propaganda around this time?
By the 1930s, the anti-religious propaganda really congeals into three main themes. It's the fear of foreign intervention, often bound up with the Catholic Church. There's collectivization of agriculture, and the idea that enemies of the revolution are trying to prevent the collectivization of agriculture, which really means forcing peasants onto collective farms and controlling their grain so that they can't sell it and set their own prices. And then industrialization, the spectacle of building the Soviet Union up into a great industrial power that can compete with the Western powers in producing industrial goods, developing the society, and of course, building war material. And it's also important to remember that in 1933, there was a concordat between the Nazi regime and the Vatican. And then in 1937, Pope Pius issues an encyclical condemning Bolshevistic and atheistic communism.
Yeah, well, to quickly return to the theme of industrialization, I know there's a poster in your book that shows sort of a massive hydroelectric dam just washing away all of these religious figures like priests and mullahs and rabbis. Could we talk quickly about that piece before moving on?
There's an issue of the magazine Godless dated 1930, which really exemplifies the use of industrial imagery. It's quite a gloomy cover. It's all in blues and grays and black. And it shows a big dam. And in the background, you have black smokestacks spewing out black smoke. Then in the lower left-hand corner of the image, you have a priest, a mullah, and a rabbi being swept through a dam sluice. So it's like a bad joke.
Yeah, an awful joke. And there's one little guy in the bottom left. I can't really identify him. He's sort of wearing a suit, and I presume he's just some sort of generic capitalist or something.
A generic enemy of the revolution. But this is all a euphemism for murder. Of course, there's going to be mass murder of clergy throughout the 1930s.
Yeah, and in this sort of renewed wave of religious persecution, it wasn't just Orthodox priests that sort of featured as the saboteurs. They began to focus a little bit on the religious enemies abroad, namely the Catholic Church. I know there's one that I've got in front of me here, and it sort of shows the Pope, hiding behind a church with his gigantic tongue out, and he looks a bit monstrous. Could we talk quickly about this piece? Because it seems to be the poster that features the Catholic Church most prominently as a foreign menace.
So as regards perception of a foreign threat, there's a poster dated 1932 under the headline, "Priestly Rhetoric is an Enemy Weapon." And this focuses on a Soviet interpretation of an alliance between fascism and the foreign clergy. So you've got the Pope preaching, and you've got other religious figures preaching beside him. You've got priests praying to a golden capitalist sitting on a safe. And then you've got a kind of bayonet charge led by the international clergy, backed by a cannon-wielding capitalist. And so you've got a Catholic priest, an Orthodox priest, an Islamic mullah, and even a Jewish rabbi involved in this bayonet charge with fascists. And in fact, the rabbi absurdly is pictured next to a swastika waving Nazi. And this shows what absurd contortions the Soviet atheist ideology was getting into at this stage, where the Nazi persecution of the Jews was something that just didn't fit the ideological framework, and so it's totally ignored. Curiously, the piece also carries a poem by a lousy communist poet named Demyan Biedny, whose name, Biedny means poor in Russian, whose name is the inspiration for the atheist poet Ivan Homeless in Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita. There's another image from 1934, Godless magazine, True Face of the Catholic Church. And it shows a skull that has spider legs and a Pope hat, and there are burning bodies in the background. Of course, the Soviets were very interested in the Catholic Inquisition's burning of scientists because they saw themselves as friends of science. And in the lower right-hand corner, you've got Nazis burning copies of books by Marx and Lenin and Darwin. And also in the background, you have people being hung from nooses, which may be a reference to fascism. And that taps into all of the fear of a Western crusade against the Soviet state, influenced by the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and this crusade obviously came in 1941, although it wasn't led by the Catholic Church. It was obviously the Nazi invasion. And during the war, Soviet anti-religious propaganda essentially ceased, due in large part to pressure from the Soviet Union's newfound allies, especially the Roosevelt administration. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so here's an interesting quote. This was issued by the Roosevelt administration in the U.S. Right after the Germans had invaded Russia in June 1941. And it was a message about the importance of religious freedom. The statement says, "Freedom to worship God as their consciences dictate is the great and fundamental right of all peoples. This right has been denied to their peoples by both the Nazi and Soviet governments. To the people of the United States, this and other principles and doctrines of communistic dictatorship are as intolerable and as alien to their own beliefs as are the principles and doctrines of Nazi dictatorship." There was a lot of pressure from the Roosevelt administration to abandon this ideology and this anti-religious ideology. And Roosevelt, I think, was, he was deeply religious. He felt personally offended by this anti-religious project, and he applied pressure on the Soviets to abandon it. At the same time, when the Germans began to move into former Soviet-held territory, they also began to open churches as a propaganda strategy, or at least the Wehrmacht did. There were all kinds of competing strategies among the Germans. They were flying blind into Russia. Really, they hadn't worked out really what their policy to the region was. So there were all kinds of conflicting things going on, but this reopening of churches was one thing that the Germans were trying to win over local populations. And so I suppose Stalin felt he had to compete with that as well.
Yeah, and on the topic of the Nazis reopening churches, I remember reading in Godless Utopia that the Nazis had been courting Orthodox support even since the 20s.
That's true. Well, there was a profoundly anti-Semitic Orthodox right that had gone into exile after the Russian Revolution, and so some of the chief German ideologists, Nazi ideologists like Alfred Rosenberg, were in touch with these people.
I see. Interesting. To jump back forward to the Second World War, in the Soviet Union, anti-religious propagandizing was toned down or stopped entirely, but Stalin didn't permit a full revival of religious life in the USSR, did he?
No, I mean, what happened was he allowed some seminaries to reopen. He allowed some churches to reopen. He allowed religious life to resurface. But I think even so, if you were outwardly religious, you were not going to be seen as a good communist. So I'm sure there were many calculations left to be made.
I see. And during the war, there was more or less no anti-religious propaganda being published. I think, if I remember correctly, Godless magazine stopped publishing maybe even a few days after the German invasion in 1941.
The magazine Godless ceased publication, as far as I can tell, the month the Germans invaded. It was seen as not serving the war effort.
Okay, and this lull in anti-religious propaganda lasted until the late 50s. So if we could just fast forward a decade or so to Stalin's death, could you explain what was happening in the Soviet Union then and sort of set the scene for this second wave?
So between the end of the war and Stalin's death, anti-religious repression tends to focus mainly on minorities. So you have the expulsion of the Chechens, who Stalin accused of supporting the Germans. You have the smashing of the Ukrainian Uniate Church and the destruction of its membership, and you have the anti-Semitic campaign. You also have the pressing into service of the Orthodox clergy as critics of American foreign policy. So the new job of the Orthodox clergy is to speak publicly against U.S. foreign policy, and they do that, for example, against the American military efforts in Korea. For example, the Russian Orthodox clergy critiqued the Americans very severely over the Korean War, and that's where things sit until Stalin's death and the rise of Nikita Khrushchev.
I see. So Stalin's death and the sort of subsequent denunciation of him in the secret speech kind of signals a new stage in Soviet anti-religious propaganda. Is that right?
Yeah, so after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's legacy, accused Stalin of trying to turn himself into a god, denounced the so-called cult of personality. This was his 1956 secret speech, and there followed a so-called thaw. People were being let out of the Gulag camps. Intellectual life of the Soviet Union was becoming a bit more open. But the thaw did not apply to religious life. On the contrary, since atheism was such a marker of Bolshevism and the Russian Revolution, and since Stalin was portrayed as having deviated from that, a return to atheism was a claim to legitimacy for the Communist Party. And so they returned to atheist propaganda particularly heavily in 1959, just a couple of years after Sputnik went up, which meant that atheist propaganda became closely bound up with the space race. Also in 1959, there was a new anti-religious magazine launched called Science and Religion. That was a black and white magazine. It was illustrated, but the illustrations are not particularly remarkable, so they weren't included in this book.
So this new wave of propaganda starts in around 1959 and lasts on and off until the sort of late 80s. Could we talk about the imagery and shift of focus in this propaganda, because it's very distinct from the sort of stuff that we were seeing in the 20s and 30s, certainly less graphic?
So this new anti-religious propaganda imagery that starts in 1959 carries on in various forms until the early 1980s or the mid-1980s. It really collapses around 1986 with the beginnings of Glasnost, and then the nail in the coffin was the 1988 Millennium celebrations, because the Russian Orthodoxy had begun in Kievan Rus in 988. So 1988 was the 1,000-year anniversary, and the Orthodox Church was allowed to celebrate that in the Bolshoi Theater, and they were allowed to celebrate it in collaboration with stars of the Soviet stage and screen. And this was partly because Gorbachev needed all the support he could get for Glasnost, and turning to religious believers was one way to get additional support. And of course, the support he needed was against the Soviet hardliners who opposed his reforms. But even in the years leading up to Glasnost, you see a new type of Soviet atheist propaganda, which is not as, certainly nowhere near as harsh and gruesome as the early stuff, but it's satirical, and it tends to mock fashion and Western influence. And so, for example, there's one image of a guy who looks kind of slightly Jesus-like in ridiculous sunglasses, wearing crucifixes around his neck, and he's selling icons and crucifixes, possibly on the black market. And he's seen as a disreputable character. There's another scene of a hipster guy walking along the beach with a giant crucifix around his neck. The image is actually a parody of a famous Russian painting, Alexander Ivanov's Appearance of Christ Before the People. The emphasis is on appearance and fashion, and of course, in the late Soviet period, adopting religious symbols was like a sign of rebellion. It was almost like wearing a punk outfit in London or something like that.
Yeah, well, the general tone of this wave of propaganda definitely seems a lot more playful than the sort of stuff you're seeing in the 20s, where religious believers and authorities tend to figure more as, sort of sinister and scheming counter-revolutionaries and vermin. It's definitely a lot more sort of pointed in the 20s. There's also a subgenre within the second wave which tends to show cosmonauts denouncing or denying the existence of God, the most famous of which is one from the mid-70s, which shows a cosmonaut floating up in space, cheerily declaring that there are no gods. Could we speak about that poster? Because it's certainly one of the most famous from this period, if not the most famous.
Yeah, this image, which is dated 1975, well, what it suggests to me is a kind of medieval conception of the sky, the firmament. And it's not really clear to me why having an astronaut in space means that there's no God. It seems like a little bit of a non sequitur, just as the Soviet cosmonauts were expected to state their atheism, while the American astronauts were always talking about their faith. So it's a curious non sequitur, but as a piece of design, it just kind of works. The thing to remember about this is that you see these various temples at the bottom of the page. This really symbolizes a kind of human rights catastrophe, with religious congregations across the Union being often broken up by very, very sleazy and dishonest means by the Communist Party, and sometimes having the physical buildings destroyed as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot going on in this poster. Do you think that the cosmonaut that features in it is Yuri Gagarin, or just maybe a generic, cosmonaut?
Yeah, people tend to assume that this cosmonaut is Yuri Gagarin. Well, he's kind of a generic cosmonaut, but it's worth mentioning that the most vocal of the atheist cosmonauts was actually the second Soviet cosmonaut to orbit the Earth, and that was German Titov. German Titov went to the Seattle World's Fair in 1962 and told the Americans he'd seen no God or angels in space.
Interesting. So this Soviet propaganda, Soviet anti-religious propaganda, was on the wane and more or less finished by the mid-1980s. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were some interesting cultural milestones in the late or in the mid-1980s. So, for example, there was a novel published by Chingiz Aitmatov, well-known Soviet writer, called The Scaffold, and that was full of religious themes, and it had been very criticized in the communist press, but the debate surrounding that novel was a milestone. And then Yevgeny Yevtushenko, the glasnost-supporting poet, wrote an article about how young Soviet citizens couldn't understand literature properly because they couldn't read the Bible, and that it really ought to be easy to get the Bible and read it and just become cultured as a result.
Yeah, so there are all of these cultural shifts, and as you explained earlier, the sort of newly emboldened Orthodox Church that was able to celebrate its millennium in the Bolshoi theatre, all of this sort of, conspired to end the Soviets' propaganda, anti-religious propaganda regime. Anyway, I thought we could wrap this podcast up with a short discussion about what sort of place this book occupies in the current political and intellectual climate. You told me at the start of this podcast that the first stirrings of the book emerged a decade or so ago when the new atheists were at their zenith and everybody was talking about atheism again. How do you think it fits into the early 2020s? Almost a century on from the first wave of Soviet anti-religious propaganda.
So before I started work on this book, I was working on Iran as a journalist. I traveled to Iran in 2008 and 2011, so I knew a little bit about the country. And I was writing about Iranian affairs, including the human rights situation. One of the issues that came up there was the situation of the Baha'is, who are the largest religious minority in Iran, who are not properly recognized and are very badly treated. They have their shops closed, their graveyards smashed up. They're not allowed to get university education. So that was in the back of my mind when I started working on this. And around that time, we had the rise of ISIS as well, and the horrible atrocities against religious minorities across the territory they controlled. Also, there was the Uyghur situation in China. So these were all kind of on my radar when I was writing. And I sometimes wonder what the trickle-down effect of the popular atheism of the post 9/11 era has been. So now I'm sure that if Christopher Hitchens were alive today, he would be at the forefront of standing up for groups like the Uyghurs and the Yazidis, at least from a human rights point of view. But maybe the trickle-down effect, the kind of dumbed-down, refined or unrefined version of that popular atheism, is that the rights of these minorities are a little bit of a tough sell for Western liberals who've kind of moved on from religion. And that's something that I do think about. And I do regard this question primarily from a human rights point of view.
Yeah, well, obviously the new atheist movement has sort of not only long fizzled out, but has actually suffered a bit of pushback in recent years, especially it seems from the followers of Jordan Peterson and sort of similar personalities. I know I saw your tweet recently about how Peterson is an admirer and I think even a collector of Soviet propaganda and art.
So I was aware of Jordan Peterson when I was working on the book, and I was listening to some of his lectures in my spare time. In a sense, I feel like Christopher Hitchens and Jordan Peterson can be seen as like pop cultural bookends to the project. And, well, I suppose Jordan Peterson deserves some credit for repopularizing Russian literature for a new generation. And he certainly seems to be drawn to what we call the Slavophile authors. So the Orthodox conservatives in the Russian tradition, like Solzhenitsyn and Dostoevsky. And he also seems to be profoundly formed by the Reagan era. So I guess he would have been a young man at the time Reagan became president. He probably would have been quite impressionable at the time of Ronald Reagan's Evil Empire speech. And I think he does bear those influences. And I think he's also a bearer of that meme that we talked about earlier on, that kind of atheism equals tyranny meme, which comes off the back of both Reagan's Evil Empire speech and Solzhenitsyn's Templeton Prize speech. The interesting thing is that those are not exactly the same meme because, of course, Reagan was working within the framework of the U.S. Constitution, which is fundamentally an Enlightenment document, whereas Solzhenitsyn was drawing on a Slavophile tradition, which was counter-Enlightenment. And those ambiguities are fascinating to me. And if I ever have a chance to speak to Jordan Peterson, I would like to drill down on those ambiguities and perhaps build a discussion of them off the back of this book.
Yeah, we should see if we could mobilize the Propagandopolis army to get his attention and try and arrange a little discussion between the two of you. Anyway, Roland, thanks so much for speaking with me today. It's been fascinating, and it's surely a subject that warrants many more hours of discussion. I'm sure all of my listeners are going to go and buy your book immediately at propagandopolis.com. Thanks again, Roland. So that was Roland Elliott Brown speaking with me. He's a London-based writer, and he can be found on Twitter at Roland E. Brown. You can also find him on Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown, or on Facebook with the Godless Utopia Facebook page. Thank you to everyone listening to this debut episode of the Propagandopolis podcast. We're probably going to come up with a catchier name in the future, but for the time being, we'll just stick with Propagandopolis podcast. We've also set up a Patreon, so that's patreon.com/Propagandopolis. We intend to do many more of these, as well as to start doing some videos on YouTube, and we're also working on a few publications at the moment, so keep your eyes peeled. If you'd like to buy yourself a copy of Roland's book, Godless Utopia, we have a limited number available on the website at the moment, propagandopolis.com. And if you don't already, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Propagandopolis. Thanks again for listening.